My name is Allison Hunt, and I'm going to read you my first book. It's called The Wizards of Havenbell, The Child of Harmony, written by Allison Hunt, copyright 2004. Chapter 1, The Maze of Maylene. The rain fell like a blizzard of diamonds inside an old mystical forest far away. Sheets of rain hummed on the top of the roof that sheltered the only inhabitant of the island. The elven girl gazed out of the window at the newly moistened foliage, wondering what lay beyond the hills where the trees thickened. She sat relaxed but always alert of her surroundings. Spending many summers in the forest, Trillium had somehow become part of it, and anything that entered the woods gave off a vibration, like she could feel their presence. She had explored every detail of this old mystical place. Sometimes she could hear a whisper, a voice in the wind, a vibrating life within the forest of Maylene. As the rain fell, she closed her eyelids as if in meditation. She opened her mossy green eyes and rose to observe the thick of hundreds of trees in the distance. Eagerness filled her for what lay beyond them. She enjoyed the peaceful element of her home, not to mention the mystery of the forest. The excitement that had been building up inside of her could no longer hold. She fled out of the door into the sprinkling rain. The air smelled fresh and fragrant. The rain fell on her face and trickled down her neck, making her soft, curly hair turn into auburn ringlets. The wind blew locks of hair back from her pointed ears and glowing emerald eyes, both true traits of the elves. Her shelter was a stone dwelling. It was a decent-sized home for an elf, with a main door, 3 windows, and a small fireplace inside for cooking and for cold nights. The ceiling was leak-free, and there was even a bed that had always been there. She remembered how huge it seemed as a child, but of course she grew into it over a few summers. Her bow and arrow sat nicely in the corner, along with a candle and her self-made pack. A broken piece of mirror was propped on one wall. Outside her home was a beautiful garden full of lilies, daffodils, and forget-me-nots that overflowed in their boxes. A white owl flew overhead, hooted, and then landed in the tree next to the girl. His feathers were starch white like baby powder and speckled with black spots. From his head, 2 huge yellow eyes gleamed like shiny coins. He was a thick feathered ghost owl with fluffy feet and a solid black beak. His eyes brightened up when he saw the fair-skinned girl. "Good morning, Duran," she greeted him without having to turn around. She knew he had returned. "Good morning, Trillium," he cooed. "The day awaits and the forest calls." The two were companions and close friends. Duran had taken care of her when she was young and trained her in archery. He was the only enchanted owl she had ever met. Duran traveled to Phaethia and Fairy Island for supplies like cloth and seeds. He didn't speak or share much about his travels. He taught her rules and disciplines, but vaguely spoke of when or where she would use them. There were no other elves on the island, no one that she had ever encountered. "I will continue to search for the entrance to the maze after the rain lifts." She held her face to the sky, letting raindrops slowly trickle down her cheeks. The forest seemed to sigh around her, and a refreshed smile filled her smooth skin. The rain showered the garden, making the flowers and vegetables green and fresh. Duran brought her seeds to plant, and she tended her garden most often. He went to Phaethia, the land of the elves, once a year to gather the seeds. Trillium liked to watch things grow and ate mostly what she grew. Sometimes she hunted, but only if the meat and fur were needed. Duran watched her intensely, the yellow color of his sparkling eyes turning almost black. Trillium's elf-green eyes shifted into a crystal blue. Duran noticed the change, but he would not tell her of the transformation. She would not yet understand. The clouds started to part and sunbeams streamed through the forest, hitting each leaf's dew, making the trees glow brilliantly. A beam danced in her eyes, fading the blue to a very earthy green as the sun warmed her skin. "The entrance is beyond. You must prepare for your journey," Duran informed. "Almost ready," she answered and rushed into her dwelling to grab her belongings. As she entered, she saw a green flicker out of the corner of her eye. A very old amulet hung on the piece of mirror on the wall. As it swayed back and forth, the gem sparkled. "Mother," Trillium whispered and picked up the amulet. Its earthy gem flashed, and the intricate golden designs around it felt smooth between her fingers. She slid the necklace over her head and tucked it under her deerskin clothing. Trillium longed for her mother's face and warmth. She had been so young when she arrived in Maylene, and her memories had begun to fade like dreams often do. She knew she would never see her mother again, but her sorrow no longer burned like her spirit. Trillium picked up the amulet and clasped it around her neck. Then she grabbed her water skin and candle and put them in the pack along with fruit, vegetables, and dried meat. She trained with her bow and arrows at an early age and became a very good shot. Elves were also known for their supreme skills in archery. With everything ready, she left her stone house, the only shelter she had known for many summers, and looked again. A troubling thought occurred to her and lingered in her mind like an echo in a cave. How soon will I come back? She wondered. Will I ever come back? On the way towards the creek, all trouble left Trillium's mind like the flutter of a butterfly's wing. The forest filled her with amazing energy, and she eagerly enjoyed its sweetness. Trillium dashed through the woods, jumping over rocks and twigs. She moved with lightning speed. Everything flashed by, making a brown and green mosaic from the fabulous mixing of earth tones. As she ran, Duran followed her from above. She explored the woods every day and memorized all she saw, but it failed at her attempts to enter the maze. She could hear the soft roar of the ocean, but never made it out to sea. She was trapped in by walls and forest, and would need to beat the maze to finally see it. Behind her home was an enormous stone wall. The rocks that protruded out from it were sharp and jagged. When she was younger, she often tried to climb over the towering wall. It often resulted in injury when inside her heart she knew she could not cheat the maze. The only way would be to explore the forest where the trees thickened. She believed this was the outer wall, but could find no way in. She jogged through the trees and came to a small path that led to a clear creek that trickled through the forest. She dipped her water skin in. The water fell smooth over the rocks, making many small bubbling pools. The stream stretched for a ways and then came to a curve. Loneliness faded in and out of her heart. All these summers she had done fine with Duran and the forest creatures as company, except for the constant heartache she felt for her mother. The older she got, the more she wanted to get out of Maylene and meet other elves and life forms. Trillium had once asked Duran to take her away to Phadia, even though she knew he could not, and that her future was the maze. Lately, her dreams were flooded with images of unknown others and elves as well. One in particular stood out from the rest, a handsome man with greenish-gold eyes, yellow hair, and 2 large white wings that grew from his back. It was him that she now saw as she gazed in the water. Duran watched closely, wondering what she was thinking. The greenish-gold eyes disappeared, snapping Trillium back to reality. The water skin filled and was stored back into the pack. Trillium looked up at the branch that Duran was perched on and gave a head nod to continue the quest. By the time they reached the outer maze, it was nearing noon. The sun was bright and warm on the forest canopy. The floor of the forest was shaded and cool, the leaves lit up with the sun shining through them. Glints of sun hit Trillium's face as she walked. Trees began to get closer. She had found the outside of the maze. Thorn bushes climbed up the base of the giant trees, making it very painful to slip between them. Duran landed on Trillium's shoulder and rubbed his soft white head against her neck. This was his way of showing affection. Trillium smiled. There are no shortcuts, no way to cheat it. The purer your heart, the clearer the way. There will be danger. Who knows what lives in this maze? If you are true, you'll find the way, he coached. There's one small problem. I haven't found the entrance yet, Trillium said, a little disappointed. Duran's eyes began to shift and stare wildly. The black in the center dilated until almost no gold was visible. You will, Trillium, you will, he cooed, and flew off into the sky. Trillium stared wondrously at him until he was no longer in view. Calling for him would do no good. He often left without any explanation, and right now he was not her main concern. A loud cracking sound shot through the forest as Trillium fell from a tree. The branch scraped her leg on the way down and spilled her hard into the dirt. The sharp branch had poked her calf, sending pain up her leg. She had been trying to find the way in by observing every bush and tree. The trees grew tightly intertwined, making the wall of the outer maze. She fell trying to sneak a peek at the inside and had earned herself a nice bloody scrape. No shortcuts, Duran had said, she reminded herself, despite the throbbing in her leg. Trillium continued to observe the trees. After a while, with no luck and an empty stomach, it was time to rest. There was a tall tree with soft grass underneath that looked peaceful and inviting. She took out some fruit and vegetables for lunch, freshly picked from her own garden the day before. Filled up and once again hopeful, Trillium sprang up ready to find the way in. No trouble ever stayed in her mind or mood for too long. The throb in her leg persisted, but she successfully tucked this into the corner of her mind and moved on. Moving quickly, she scanned carefully for a tunnel or door. In the distance, she could see a patch of blue flowers she had never seen before in Maylene. Trillium moved towards them and saw a circle of 8 dying oak trees. In the center was a small oak just beginning to grow. The sun came down in one brilliant beam on the small meadow. It made the blue flowers glow like the sky. Some may live while others die. The beauty left shall fight and strive, her mind sang. It was an old nursery rhyme Duran had taught her. Trillium jogged the deep corners in her mind until she could remember the strange rhyme. Suddenly it all unfolded before her. She walked slowly through the flowers into the circle of dead trees and leaned down to touch the new oak sprout. A stone circle moved upwards out of the dirt next to the living tree, making a grinding sound as it surfaced. Trillium watched with surprise. It was a small stone cylinder with a hinge on top. Carefully clamping the ridge between 2 fingertips, the capsule opened with ease. Inside was a small yellow scrap of paper. She opened it and read, "Face the old trees. Between the center 2 is the maze of Maylene." A burning sensation began on her chest, and she grabbed for the chain around her neck. "It's glowing. Never has it done that before." Trillium stared at it in awe. It shimmered in emerald green and sent off powerful waves of warmth. "This must be the way," she confirmed. The amulet dimmed. Trillium put the small paper back into the cylinder's opening. After clicking the lid, it rotated back into the ground with a high-pitched scraping sound that made Trillium cringe. The answer was staring me in the face all this time, but the flowers were not here before, she wondered. The matter was quickly thrown out of her mind by the gratefulness of finding the entrance. Although things disturbed her, Duran had taught her not to focus energy on the negative or dwell on uncertainties. She looked straight ahead and her amulet lit up once again. She walked through the old oaks and touched the wall behind it. The large stone wall behind the trees began to roll slowly to the right. Twigs, branches, and ivy snapped as the stone wheels turned slowly, breaking free of many summers' worth of overgrowth. Trillium walked through the entrance and into the maze. She looked into the maze's interior and grinned at the sight of unknown territory and adventure. Then she noticed something that made her heart stop. All of the sounds in the forest had completely vanished, not a bird or crack or tap of any animal. This made her uneasy, scared, and worst of all, the sun was starting to go down. It had seemed like just a half an hour had gone by, but Trillium realized it had been half of the day. To her left was a long stretch of path. She could clearly see the wall that was at its end. Dead end. That only leaves one direction, she decided. Trillium traveled right where the path began to curve, moving fast considering her wounded leg. She had to use the last of the sunlight before it turned dark. The nights were still very cold and pitch black. The forest smelled pleasantly sweet. The vegetation grew lush and many unusual flowers grew in thick clusters. The air began to chill a little, and a small spring breeze blew about. Trillium began to jog around the turn. It was wide and very long. It soon became tiring, but she pressed on. The sky was getting darker by the second, and just as she believed the curve would never end, she came out into a clearing. Trillium turned around and faced 3 openings, the one she came out of, and 2 leading 2 different directions. On the right was the circular clearing. She walked around the circle, finding nothing but grass. It was completely dark now, and she sat and rested on the soft earth. Trillium reached for her pack and retrieved a white candle. Setting the candle down in front of her, she began to chant. "Candle, candle, show for me, woodeth my way I'd like to see. Out of Maylene to the wondrous sea, help me find my destiny." The flame lit itself in a bright flash. She then began to aid her wounded leg. Her mind swirled and thoughts raced about the 2 entrances. She decided waiting until daylight would be smarter than going in the dark. She sprawled on the ground, stretched out her body, and fell asleep the minute she laid her head down. Dreams began to flood her mind. She saw nothing but could hear a faint voice, a soft voice, in her mother's words. The fuzzy veil of black lifted to reveal her mother's face. It was crystal clear, unlike her fading memories. Smooth skin, earthy eyes, and narrow-pointed ears like her own. Her features were small and delicate. Her light brown hair bounced on her shoulders. Her mother was inside the woods in Fathia. She rubbed her stomach where a baby was growing. Jasha knew it was a girl. She knew it right away. Underneath a nearby tree, a group of white flowers grew close to the trunk. They were the most common wildflower in the forest of Phadia. I shall name you Trillium, her voice sang softly, because it is made from the earth, water, fire, and wind. With these elements as one, a more beautiful life is born. Her eyes looked like a forest that seemed to take you into its branches and entwine you in its ivy and moss. Her mother's hand was in a fist. She opened it to reveal a green stone. This will help you, she whispered so silently that Trillium thought she could hear bells ringing. She awoke slowly. She could hear Duran calling her name. She blinked at the sunlight until her eyes could focus on the owl. You did very well. I knew you could get in, he chirped. Duran, I had this dream. She stopped abruptly and saw something on the ground next to her. It was the stone. Duran, it passed through my dream. It passed through. It's as green as my mother's eyes, Trillium said, half dazed. Duran shifted on the branch. She continued. I had a dream about her in the night. Her face was so clear it was like being with her again. She stared off, remembering the images. I have a feeling that the stone has something to do with the maze, but I can't figure it out. A crooked smile sat upon her lips. Then once again her troubles were stored in her mind for later. Duran had a good advantage. He could see the maze from above, and he often spoke of the ocean beyond. Help was not given to her. This was made clear in the beginning. Information from him was always left unfinished. Duran never talked about what lay beyond the sea, Phadia and Fairy Island being the only exceptions. He told her that if he helped her, it would interfere with her own learning. She felt a lot of love for Duran, her only friend and wise teacher. Trillium knew him well enough to trust his words and never asked many questions. She ate some more fruit for breakfast and drank the crystal-clear water. I wonder which path is the right one, she asked herself after repacking her bag. Duran cocked his head to the side. His eyes grew large in surprise as he watched the girl dash gracefully into the passage furthest left. She moved fast. Duran began to fly after her, following her from above. What makes you sure this is the right way? Duran called down loudly. I followed my heart like you told me to. My heart feels this is the way. I sense it. White fire, that's what you called it once, she replied. Duran hooted with satisfaction. Now you're starting to understand, he cheered. After a very long curve, twice as long as the first, the maze twisted and turned. She went through 3 tight curves and up a long straight. She walked at a medium pace, a little tired from the long distance traveled in this day. Time seemed to bend in the maze. Getting into it seemed to take all day. I've been traveling for hours, but it only seems like it's only afternoon. The maze remained absolutely silent and eerie. The path she followed was made of dirt, and small pebbles scuffled as she walked. The walls of the maze were made out of gigantic trees that seemed to touch the sky. The trees grew close to each other, leaving no room in between. Trillium admired the maze and its unknown creator. It truly was beautiful and clever. She saw some more blue flowers growing in patches and asked Duran about them. I believe they are called bachelor buttons, Duran gladly answered. At least they were last time I asked. Who did you ask? Trillium inquired, trying not to push him. The fairies grow them in Fairy Island. What's it like? Trillium asked, eager for more detail. It's a place of magic and beauty. There are acres of flower fields. Bachelor buttons grow all over and come in many different colors. Trillium imagined running through a field of red, orange, and blue flowers and was interrupted by a strange feeling that entered her awareness. She had never been into the maze until yesterday, but she had a very close connection to the forest. She was aware that they were not alone. A crow landed on a broken trunk of a rotted tree and began to cackle. The veil of silence lifted. Trillium could hear the sounds of the forest again, and she listened to the high twitters and sweet songs of the birds, too many to distinguish. Trillium's stomach did flips, but she was relieved to hear the noises again. I've never seen a black bird like that before, Duran. What a horrible noise it makes. Just then an image flashed in her head. Trillium was 10 summers old, and Duran had been training her with the bow and arrows. They had set up targets by the clearing near her home. They propped them up in the trees, and Trillium was challenged to shoot them. Each shot fired never tapped a target. A bird had perched on one of the targets. It was black and unknown to the forest. Duran told her that the evil bird was a crow. He also said that they bring danger and darkness wherever they go. Trillium, at 10 summers old, shot the crow with no hesitation, striking it in the neck. "That's the most awful noise I've ever heard," she said. Now she saw the bird for a second time. Faster than Duran could respawn, the bird lay dead on the floor with the arrow through it. "Don't bother, Duran, I remember," Trillium laughed. Duran let out joyous hoots. "And I hope I don't see another." She pulled the arrow out of the crow while holding it with one foot. Slinging her bow behind her, she moved on. At the end of the long straight passage was a left curve. An identical straightway began, and she judged it looked just as long as the one she came out of. The brush was very overgrown and made a canopy over her head. In fear of spiders, she kept an arm out in front of her. Trillium started to run. The long ferns reached out, scratching her skin. Small animals rustled in the leaves as she dashed by. After a while, her leg began to throb. The cut was healing, but the big purple bruise took its place. With her heart pounding, she started walking to catch her breath. She had almost run the whole stretch. In need of some rest, she sat on a fallen tree and began to eat and drink. Duran flew off for some dinner as well and said he would be back in the morning. After eating, Trillium was ready to move on past the straight corridor. The path curved left, and another straight way waited for her. It was as long as the eye could see. The canopy path narrowed until she had to walk sideways through it. When it opened up, the trees were no longer. The maze wall turned into stone and reached up about 25 feet. Whoever created this maze was clever and skilled. Why would they want to leave it? This was a question that lingered in her mind and in her emotions. It was turning evening, and a colder chill was in the air. Trillium knew she had to get as far as she could before dark, and started to jog again. Halfway through the stretch, the sun began to set, making the scattered clouds iridescent pink and orange fire. She stopped and reached for her candle. "Candle, candle, show for me. Woodeth my way I'd like to see. Out of Malene to the wanderous sea. Help me find my destiny." The wick flickered and lit with a burst of fire. She insisted to press on. She unrolled some deerskin to drape herself in, and immediately the layers warmed her up. The forest made her uneasy at night, and she couldn't see much except for the path. The shadows that fell made the ground come alive. The grass swayed, and the wind that blew through the trees made its thunderous roar. The stone walls fortunately blocked the wind on the path. The end of the trail curved right and split into two different directions. One path stayed straight and the other went left. Trillium began to wonder about how long the maze must have taken to build. She took the path in front of her that led into a sharp right turn. She followed the maze's twists and curves until late into the night. After some time, Trillium came upon a giant tree that grew in the middle of the stone walls. It towered high above her, its arms reaching like tentacles. As she held the candle up to it, shadows danced on the wall of the maze. The flickering candle animated the branches, making them twist and twitch. The limbs and arms reached out wildly. Trillium's heart raced at first sight of this massive figure. Her eyes began to dilate until she could see the tree more clear now. It stood still and began to look like a comfortable place to sleep. She set the candle down and blew it out with a swift breath. In the night she dreamt of a large stone structure with towers on each of the four corners. As she watched, it slowly began to crumble away until there was only one tower left standing. There was a beautiful girl. She was not an elf, and she had small round ears and big brown eyes. A long piece of material full of design and color hung loose to her feet. She had pink dainty wings and sang beautiful songs of harmony that seemed to put Trillium in a trance. "My name is Eternity. I am the Chantress. Who are thee?" The girl sang like a bird. Music and rhyme had not been heard by Trillium since before she left Phaedia. It somehow was soothing to hear somebody singing again. She could faintly remember the gatherings of elves where people danced and played music together. The sun illuminated around the small winged girl. Her brown hair hung long down her back. Before Trillium could answer, she began to wake up, the sun shining in her face. She put her hand over her eyes to block the sun. "Duran?" she asked the fuzzy white ball that looked down at her from a tree. He ticked his tongue, then flew over to her and nuzzled her neck. "What is made out of stone, is very tall, and has towers for each of its corners?" Trillium asked, and then yawned. "Is this a riddle?" Duran inquired. "It's not a riddle, nor a joke, but a dream." "You had a dream about a castle? But you've never seen one!" Duran became excited at this. "A castle? That sounds wonderful!" Trillium exclaimed. A big smile grew on her face. What's its purpose? I've told you about kings and queens and other rulers of the lands. They live there. I've seen 3, and they are very beautiful. Duran twittered with glee. Do you suppose I will ever see one? You will someday. It looked peaceful, a little strange, but very serene, she daydreamed. When her thought broke, she jumped to her feet, ready to go again. I want to solve this maze and see what's beyond Maylene. There was a fork visible in the road ahead. A gold flicker of light gleamed from the path. Trillium rushed to ease her curiosity and looked down at the object. It was a golden half-circle. She examined the details on the gold plate and reached down to pick it up. In the center was the letter T. Next to it she found a brand new arrow. It looked like it had a pure silver tip. All of her arrows were getting old and worn from use. The point of the new arrow was definitely sharp. She looked at the gold object again. My name? She asked Duran. There must be another half to the gold circle. That might help us understand what the letter T is for. Duran helped. I can't look for the other piece now. I have to solve this maze, Trillium said with some disappointment. Duran wished her well on her search and then left again. Trillium felt love for him but was troubled by her mission. Duran held her with high expectations. She was tired of not knowing whom she was and where she was going. She longed for someone to communicate with and tell her more about the other islands outside of Maylene. Duran helped a little, but would never tell her all of the truth. Where she stood in the fork, she could see a path going up, one to the side and one going south. Trillium decided to go south. The smooth stone walls began to get colder and jagged. Up ahead, she could see a big tree towering over the stone walls. She kept traveling until she was underneath it. She was worn and dehydrated, but the water can only held a sip. She tried to jog the best she could around the curve and down the long straight. Halfway through it, she slowed again, weakness possessing her body. At the end of the straightway, the path took a small left turn. Trillium cleared the turn and rubbed her eyes in disbelief. A little energy was restored, and she ran to what she saw, her face pale and her lips an unhealthy shade of gray. She looked at the round object protruding from the ground. It was a well. She lowered her head down the top. She could hear and smell the water flowing. Instantly, she turned the crank on one side and lowered the bucket. When it came back up, water sloshed back and forth. Trillium eagerly stuck her face in the bucket and washed. The cool water was rejuvenating. She lifted her head, letting the droplets drip down her face and neck, the green of her eyes shifting into crystal blue. The water skin was refilled, and she began to chug it so fast that she was barely breathing in between gulps. She began to get color in her face and lips again, and her eyes changed back to green. When she was done, she felt more energetic and began to run through the stone maze. There was another left turn and another straightway. When she reached the end where the path curved right, she could see the tip of the giant tree again. Trillium began to feel unsure about where she was traveling and pulled the amulet out for help, but it remained cold and dark. She followed the path as it curved. There was another left turn and a long curve, the longest so far. After hours of walking, Trillium came out of the enormous bend. The forest began to take the place of the stone walls until the walls of the maze were trees once again. The sun began to disappear. There were holes worn in her boots. She sank to the ground and began to crawl left with the maze. It straightened a little and then turned right. Dragging herself, she went around another small curve. Finally, she found a clearing full of grass and flowers. The fragrance was sweet and delightful. Trillium took 4 big drinks from her water skin and sprawled on the ground. Sleep came easily to her tired muscles, feet, and bones. A hot and deadly fire swept through the forest, leaving a path of destruction and death. It was not Maylene from what Trillium saw. The temperature burned and the smoke was suffocating. Horrible screams arose on the hot wind. There were figures running away from the fire. There were other elves who had long ears like hers. Confusion ran wild. Trillium saw a man caught in the fire. He was screaming for help. She kept running with them, scared for her life. Then she noticed someone was pulling her along. Her feet felt shorter. She looked up and saw her mother's face full of terror. Trillium realized she was just a little girl and that her mother was pulling her away from the danger. The smoke was thick and burned their eyes. "The wizards have come! The wizards have come! Phadia's burning! Run! Run!" the boy shouted. Trillium's mother glanced over her shoulder at the elves trapped in the inferno. Tears rolled down her face. She could hear screams. Terror filled her mother's face as they continued to flee. Trillium opened her eyes and saw the sun lighting up the leaves in the forest canopy. Beads of sweat rolled down Trillium's face. There was so much she wanted to ask Duran, and with a quick leap she was on her feet again. Her mouth was dry, and she craved a cold drink of water. Trillium was about to leave when she spotted a round stone like the other she had found. She picked up the stone. The red and orange color swirled inside, reminding Trillium of fire, she whispered. There was a new path in front of her. The awareness she had of the forest was dim. She tried the white fire, as Duran would say, but she felt neither way was the way out. Her special senses numbed. She decided to explore the new path. Memories flooded her head as she walked. The dream of her mother replayed itself over and over again in her mind. "Caw, caw!" a bird called down from above. It instantly dove for her head. She ducked, but not fast enough, and the bird took a sharp peck out of the top of her scalp. Trillium grabbed for an arrow out of her quiver, taking a peck to the arm. She gave the crow a good swat and stuck it with the arrow in the chest. It let out a wretched squawk that made Trillium flinch. Her hand rose to her head. Her hand rose to her head to examine the wound. It wasn't very deep, but when she lifted her hand, she was not surprised to see blood. In the trees, 5 more birds waited. Their eyes were bright yellow and seemed to turn in their sockets. Their ebony feathers were shiny and reflective. Each crow with a set of dangerous claws. Trillium's stomach began turning from their dark presence. It was not often that she felt something capable of evil. As she raised her bow and arrow, all 5 birds flew at her. Trillium snapped the bow accidentally, misfiring into the hard soil. She screamed at the birds that pecked their stinging beaks into her flesh. She flipped backwards twice, knocking the birds to the ground and grabbing another arrow before she landed. In 2 blinks, Trillium stretched the bow, steadied it, and let it go, sending it soaring through the air. It pinned the bird to a tree through his chest. The awful cries grew worse, almost deafening. The sharp pain of the beaks attacking her body continued. "Ow!" she cried. A crow dug its beak into her ankle. Trillium swiftly kicked the bird and crushed its head beneath her boot. There were 3 left now. Trillium reached for a jagged rock and smashed one with it. When it fell, she pitched the rock at it. Trillium grabbed for another arrow, this one with a silver tip, and arched her bow, shooting the bird closest to her with amazing speed and accuracy. The last crow fled towards her face with angry eyes, its sharp claws ready, and beak opened, already encrusted with her blood. Before the crow reached her, it disappeared into dust. Trillium stood nervously in shock, and sweat rolled down her forehead. Her head filled with disbelief. She bent down and touched the black powder from the bird. It left a residue on her fingertips. The vibrating darkness lifted. What does this mean? She wondered. Trillium examined the kill to discover that all had turned into black powder. She pulled her arrow out of the tree, which had pinned one of the crows before it turned into dust. Wasting arrows was not an option. Duran gave her a set of 5 arrows when she was younger. She then made her own set of 10 arrows out of wood, sharpened stone, and feathers. What kind of bird turns into dust? Trillium asked herself. Duran's voice filled her mind. Crows bring ruin and pain. It is best not to let them see you at all, for they see for evil, Duran had warned her 10 summers ago. What if the wizards in my dreams are connected to the crows? It could be the only answer. They could have been a spell. But why didn't they turn into dust when I killed the first 3? The answer lay in front of her. She knelt down to pick it up. It was the silver arrow, the one she shot when they turned into dust. Trillium took her water skin and cleaned her wounds. The crows left marks all over her. The horrible dream about the wizards replayed its graphic images in her mind. She saw her mother's terrified face and heard the screams of the elves. Trillium sank to the ground with her face in her hands and began to cry. A realization hit her like a wave and crashed upon her, causing her to pause in mid-sob. If they sent the birds to find me, then that means the wizards have seen me. They found my mother, and now they're looking for me. Her head started to swim, looking for a way out of the mystery. Pieces of the puzzle started to form a rather frightening picture. She packed up and started to run. Safety was her only concern. Her mind began racing as fast as her feet. She looked at the new path in front of her. Thick gray clouds formed in the sky, hiding the sun and the heat. The wind began to blow a brisk spring gust through the trees, making them howl. Trillium, unprotected from the wind, was blasted on her face. With one arm over her eyes, she pressed on. "The giant tree!" she exclaimed. Shelter was in sight. She began to run faster, flinging the fresh mud up from the trail. The path curved a little to the right. The walls blocked the wind, but the rain continued to pour down. Running at full speed, she came around a large right turn. She came out of the familiar fork in the trail where she had found the gold half circle. There was a sharp right turn that led to the giant fir tree. Underneath the tree, it was dry and comfortable. She sat and rested. There was a puddle that formed in the path from the rain. She leaned down to look at her reflection. Blue? Trillium protested. My eyes are green, not blue. Trillium stared, trying to get used to the change. Must be the light. She finally gave in and let the subject rest. The maze was one big loop from what Trillium just went through. Odd things had been happening lately. First the dreams, then the crows, and now eyes that seemed to change in color. There's nothing I want more than to see the ocean. Now I don't know if I'll ever get out of here unless I missed a path somewhere. She got up and ran in the rain, going back the opposite way she came. Halfway through, the rain died down and finally stopped along with the wind. The dark clouds were parting, letting the sunlight through. When she came out of the curves, the path split. She remembered that the path to the left was where the path narrowed and she had to walk sideways through it. The path to the right was the one she'd missed the first time. This brightened her up. Maybe I'll find the way out after all, she said, full of hope. There was another puddle in the path. She leaned down to see her eyes again. Green, she said, just as I thought. This problem didn't leave her head like the others. It stayed on her shoulders, waiting for an explanation that never came. Although she brushed it off at first and tried her best again, she knew that they had been blue. The stone walls went away, and she was back inside the trees. It was nearing evening, and in another hour the sun would be setting. Trillium continued to follow the straight, now at a slower pace. Hunger began to nag at her, and her stomach growled. She was weak and tired. It had been yesterday when she finished the last of her vegetables. It was time to hunt or time to starve. Her weakness was growing. She gathered a pile of pine cones and began to make a trail with them. To the right of the trail, the trees became separated enough for her to venture inside. The branches snagged and snapped as she shimmied through. A clearing stood before her. She hid herself behind a tree and sat with bow and arrow ready. It wasn't long before she shot a rabbit and wrapped it in cloth for later. She followed the pinecone trail back to the maze and began following the path for a while. There was something shiny in the path ahead. The sun reflected off of the object, sending sparks of light shooting out in all directions. Trillium's mouth dropped open in bewilderment. She floated over to it and picked it up. It was the same size as the red and green stones, but it was crystal clear. The sun was setting behind the trees, and the clouds were pink and bright orange. She began to move faster. The hall in front of her was deceiving, and darkness fell fast. The candle lit itself after she sang the chant. There was a small split in the path ahead. She turned left and found a dead end. Trillium looked at the circular clearing and started to gather wood and debris. She cooked the rabbit and ate greedily, feeling more satisfied than ever. There was a low roaring sound, melodic and soothing. Her wounds began to heal and the food gave her energy. She picked up the candle and explored the other path. As she walked, the sound became louder and more intoxicating. At the end, there was a stone wall on one side. She held up the candle. It illuminated a tall, round object. Trillium came closer. She discovered a large stone circle on the wall. 4 stone hands reached out of it, waiting to clutch something. The stones could fit here, she figured, and began to set them in the hands, but one of the hands remained empty. She would wait until morning to figure it out. Trillium returned to the clearing and fell into a deep sleep. At first she saw a blurry shape, and their eyes began to focus. Her mother stood before her. This one is cold. This one is hot. This one is bold. This one is not, she spoke softly. Suddenly her eyes opened to see the sky, the forest, and the maze. She saw another stone next to her. It was brilliant blue. She gathered her belongings and headed for the stone wheel. She put the stones in order. Green, red, clear, and blue. Nothing happened. The wheel held the stones, but only in the right order. The wheel seemed to stare at her, taunting her next decision. Trillium picked up the stones and tried again. Her mother's words repeated themselves in her head. The blue stone glittered, and inside waves crashed upon one another. Water, she whispered, and placed the stone on the ground, then examined the red and orange stone. Oh, I changed this part. Okay. Water, she whispered, and placed the stone on the ground. This one is cold. Then she examined the red and orange stone. Fire. She sat it next to the water stone. She could see trees in the color of her mother's eyes. Oops. Fire. She sat it down next to the water stone. Okay. Fire. This one is hot. She looked at the green stone. It was the color of her mother's eyes. Earth, she mumbled. This one is bold. She held up the clear stone, letting light pass through. Air. This one is not. She examined them on the wheel. They fit neatly inside the hands. A loud sound began as the hands closed around them. There was a louder grinding as the wheel began to turn. The stone door opened slowly. Trillium could smell a new scent of salt and decay. When the door fully opened, she took a peek outside. Beyond was a large body of water. The tranquil roaring she heard in the maze magnified. The waves crashed upon the massive rocks. The ocean was huge. She could see nothing but water clear to the horizon. I made it out to sea, she celebrated, and joy filled her heart. Trillium was deeply taken by the ocean's massive beauty. Cheerful and relieved, Trillium went through the open door into the small sandy path. She stood staring, her eyes latched on the waves. The path began to curve back and forth and came to a circle. In the center was a plate inside the ground, identical to the one she found before she got into the maze. There was a handle on top. Lifting the stone cylinder from the ground and taking off the lid, she exposed a hole. Inside were 2 large silver coins, 3 brand new silver arrows, and a bottle of pink liquid. Trillium grabbed the bottle. She was amazed at the color inside. The sun lit up the flaming pink liquid. The label on the bottle read medicine. There was also an old scroll. She unraveled it and read the message. Gifts from a stranger. The dark wizards have stolen the shell of hope from Fairy Island. It is lost somewhere in the ocean. If it is not found, the fire will destroy us all. The wizards, she muttered. Why didn't Dron tell me? If I'm the only one to ever solve this maze, the message must be for me. I am the special one, the one to save Havenbell. Farisef sat by a waterfall next to the smooth rocks. This was his favorite place, his secret place beyond Josephera Kingdom. The life of a prince was demanding, and his father's non-stop obsession with the new council was beginning to bore him. This place he called Misty Falls was his serenity, the place where he could clear his head and be at peace. His face was smooth like a child's, and his hair was gold and hung long to his waist. He wore light, flowing clothes, a mix of cream and tan. Long wings of white feathers sat close to him, folded at his sides. Farisef could see a white object in the air approaching him. One day by the waterfall, a mysterious creature had flown in for a drink. Duran the owl, the only enchanted owl he had ever seen. Duran said he was busy on a mission training an elven girl. He never went into detail. He said this girl was the answer to the fire, the most deadly element in Havenbell. He made Farisef keep the information classified for the girl's sake. Many of the winged people spoke of the Child of Harmony. For some, it was the only hope they had left. The Child of Harmony would bring hope back to everyone. It was Duran again who would come to chat and drink the cool water. Farisef, Duran greeted. Hello again, Duran, Farisef returned. The girl is almost ready. I will return to her soon, Duran informed. Then he nodded his head to excuse himself and flew off. Farisef watched him disappear. He enjoyed his visits, even if they were brief. His mind returned to his father, the king of Josephera. Farisef lived in the sky, and the land drained him physically. He needed to return. Satisfied, he stretched his wings and flew away from Misty Falls. Trillium stored the new arrows in her quiver and began down the path to the sea. She came to the shore and felt uneasy. She had never learned to swim. The water in the forest was too shallow. Trillium had so many questions for Duran, and she needed his companionship as well. She felt lonely, helpless, and in need of a friend. Fog began to roll in and made her cold enough to throw on her extra deerskin. She sat with her arms and knees in her chest and thought about the sea. It began to scare her. Something dark appeared out of the fog. A figure stood aboard. He was draped in a long, loose black cloak. There was a boat, long, skinny, and very old. The figure held the long oar, pushing the boat closer. A shiver went up her spine. She approached with caution as the boat beached. The black cloth waved a hand slowly, inviting her in. She resisted and then was pulled in by an invisible force. She put one foot in the boat, making it wobble, and got inside nervously. A hood fell over the face of the stranger. He turned his head slightly, briefly revealing a glimpse of his hollow jawbone, and